Opioid addiction is a major crisis in America. Since 2000, more than 1 million people in the U.S. have died of overdoses, the majority due to opioids. We're here at the New York State Office of Addiction and Support speaking with Commissioner Chinazo Cunningham about the crisis and specifically how we can prevent addiction and use to begin with. So thank you so much for having us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very important topic, and I want to start with a basic question so everyone at home understands, what are opioids? Where do they come from?
So opioids are narcotics. There are things that you've heard about, like morphine, codeine, heroin. Opioids also exist in the human body naturally, but can be taken externally too. So people are prescribed opioids, typically for severe pain. And people can also get opioids really through the drug market, like through heroin and now fentanyl as well. So fentanyl is in heroin, it can be in cocaine, it can be in counterfeit pills. And that's a change that we've really seen in the last several years. So 10 years ago, there was really no fentanyl in the drug supply, and now there's a tremendous amount of fentanyl in the drug supply.
You were talking to me about something else that is found in our heroin and cocaine. What is that, and what's the harm?
Right, so we're seeing an increased amount of xylazine in the drug supply. So this is something that's relatively recent. Xylazine is a tranquilizer, a sedative that's used in veterinary medicine, so not among human beings. And so it's shown up in the drug market, unclear why or how, but it certainly is also dangerous. And so because it's a sedative, it also causes slowing down of breathing and stopping of breathing. So both an opioid and a sedative like xylazine together is a particularly dangerous combination that can really cause somebody to stop breathing.
How long have we seen this?
So there have been cycles. So a few years ago, we saw this in Puerto Rico, some xylazine use, and then it kind of went away. And then really it's only been in the last year or so that we've seen more and more xylazine in the drug market here, at least in New York.
So we're here to talk about prevention, but I want to talk about harm reduction first. What is harm reduction and how does it serve those who use?
Yes, so harm reduction is a practical set of strategies that, and a philosophical approach that recognize that people use substances or drugs, and the goal is really to reduce the negative consequences or harms associated with substance use. So harm reduction is not new. It's been around for decades and it's embraced in a lot of other countries. In the United States, we started to embrace harm reduction around the HIV epidemic. And so syringe services programs, syringe exchange sort of came into play so that people, if they did use drugs, they didn't get HIV because they used clean syringes. And so that's been around for decades, but now with the overdose epidemic, what we see is a more and more embracing of harm reduction. So the focus is on reducing harm, keeping people alive, so that if people are going to use substances, and people have used substances in this world for hundreds of years, that people can use safely so that they don't die. And really the goal is to help people become more and more healthy depending on where they are in their continuum of their substance use.
Talk to me about what that looks like. I know there's fentanyl strips, what else?
Right. So syringes and needles certainly was kind of the first harm reduction supply. More and more now, we have naloxone, also known as Narcan, which can save people if they're overdosing so that they don't die. We now have fentanyl test strips, so that if people are going to use drugs, they can check to see whether fentanyl is in their drug, and then they can change their behaviors accordingly. We also have drug checking machines. This is something we're supporting here at the state so that people can check to see if xylazine or fentanyl or other substances are in their drug supply. In addition, it's really also an approach in addition to the materials and the supplies. And so things like meeting people where they are, going out to places that don't have brick and mortar drug treatment programs and providing services there, doing outreach, linking people to services. So it's really about meeting people where they are, sort of both in their drug use and also, physically and geographically, and really trying to have accessible services that are easily available with no barrier, so that when people are ready, that the services are there and ready and they can access them the same day.
So you have the mobile units, you have the harm reduction pieces. How do you make folks at home understand there's a stigma attached? Are we helping them use the drug? Talk to me about how that's not the case, and again, reiterating, until they're ready. It gets them at a place until they're ready.
Right. So again, harm reduction is not new, and there's been a lot of research on harm reduction. And the research across the world has shown that harm reduction strategies do not encourage drug use, they do not increase drug use. But those harm reduction strategies keep people alive. They lead to less HIV and hepatitis C infection. People are more likely to link into care and to treatment. With harm reduction strategies. So we know it's effective, and we know that it doesn't lead to more people using drugs or using drugs in a more dangerous way.
Recently, there were big monetary settlements with CVS and Walgreens pharmacies in which they agreed to pay more than $10 billion over 10 to 15 years to several states in regards to lawsuits brought against them, alleging their roles in the opioid crisis. New York is slated to receive about $458 million. How will that money be allocated in New York?
Right. So we have, by statute, an opioid settlement fund advisory board. And so this advisory board was chosen by elected officials, the governor, and others. So this board was convened in June of last year and has met over 10 times since then. The board comes out with formal recommendations, and so they submitted their formal recommendations to the state on November 1st last year. And then the state takes those recommendations and moves them forward. So our advisory board came up with a list of areas where they thought these dollars should be used to support. The number one priority on that list was harm reduction.
What are your biggest challenges when it comes to fulfilling your mission to improve the lives of New Yorkers by leading a premier system of addiction services through prevention, treatment, and recovery?
The biggest challenge, honestly, that we have is stigma. The stigma that is involved with addiction in general, and then also with its treatment. Growing up in this country, we all saw messages that said, say no to drugs, and this is your brain on drugs. Messages that made it seem as if people had, if they just had willpower, if they were just strong enough, they could overcome their addiction. And we know that's not true. We know that addiction is a medical condition. And so we really have to change the narrative. We have to educate people about what addiction is and what effective treatments are. Because there is effective treatment, but people are not getting to it. And I think stigma is the biggest reason, the biggest barrier as to why people don't sort of identify as having addiction and then seek services that are life-saving.
Do you work with doctors to try to get them to prescribe other forms of pain management other than opioids? And has changing those doctors' mindsets been a challenge?
Yeah, so over the last several years, I think there's been a clear recognition that a lot of the overdoses that were happening were really in people who were prescribed medications. And so the prescription opioids were the things that were driving the overdose. When that was clear, there were major shifts in guidelines about prescribing opioids. And so now federal guidelines really recommend that doctors do not use opioids long-term to treat pain, and instead use non-medication, so physical therapy, acupuncture, exercise, stretching, and then if they do use medications, to not use opioids. So I think we've seen really big changes in how doctors really approach pain management. And there have been some issues. So I think, initially maybe the pendulum swung too far and nobody was getting opioids. I think part of that led people to the black market and to heroin. And so I think the conversation is now shifting to say, look, there's some pain that requires opioids, most of it doesn't. But we really need to work together for long-term solutions. And for the vast majority of people, that does not include opioids.
So when it comes to pain management then, can you speak to, or do you know what other drugs they may prescribe?
Right, so there's drugs that many people take, like Tylenol, right? Or like Motrin or Advil. And you know, these class of medications are pretty effective in reducing inflammation and reducing pain. And so I think it's really thinking about all the potential options, of which there's a menu of options for pain, but really saving opioids for the last option. And you know, this gets back to also the opioid manufacturers, right? That they were really pushing opioids years ago, and that is why, you know, they were found culpable and why we have the opioid settlement funds across the country.
Well, thank you so very much for your time. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.